If you or anyone you know needs motivation for stacking, this might be the video to do it. Welcome back to the Junius Maltby channel. As many of you are aware, I enjoy putting together these visual aids that come to us from sites such as Democracy or the Visual Capitalist. These particular slides that we're going to look at today all come from Democracy, and I put together several different presentations and kind of wove them together to paint a picture and to show us what potentially could happen with paper currency and the price of precious metals. And this will put it in a simple format. You know, you've always heard that saying, well, do you want me to break out the crayons and draw it for you? Do you need me to draw you a picture? Well, here it is. If you don't want to read it and all the numbers and math that involves economics and currency and supply and demand, it's actually quite simple. And we'll talk about it, and we're going to look at it here right now. So buckle up. It's not as boring as you think. There's some really good slides in here, and it gets really fun towards the end. Here we're looking at U.S. tax revenue and deficit. So for the following slides, the U.S. government spends a lot of money it does not have. On the left, you're going to see tax revenue, the actual government income, the money they have. Right, you're going to see how much, that's the stack of money they have to borrow, the money that's used to fill the budget deficit. Left plus right, so both of those stacks together equals the U.S. budget. Keep that in mind as we move forward now. So this is the U.S. budget in a single second, approximately $121,067, and this is for the year 2011. I am sure it has significantly increased in the course of the last 6 years. So the U.S. government spends 121 grand a second. Of the money shown above, the U.S. government has to borrow $52,000 a second, $52,162 every second. That's the right portion of the money. The stack of money on the right is also the amount the debt ceiling is increased every second on average. Here we see the U.S. budget in 1 minute, $7,264,020. The U.S. government spends $7 million approximately a minute. And again, this is back in 2011. Of the total money shown above, the U.S. government has to borrow $3,129,756 every minute. They're borrowing nearly half of the amount they have to spend every time for every dollar. $100 million equals a year of work for 3,500 average Americans. It takes 3,500 Americans a year to work to make $100 million. The 155 million Americans who worked with earnings in 2005 on average made $28,567 per year. In front of the 3,500 people is the $100 million pallet that they all have to work for 1 year to earn. Look carefully to see a stack of 1 million and the 35 average Americans required to earn that 1 million in 1 year. So you can see there all those people have to work for a year just to earn the money in that palletized stack of cash. And then you see the 35 people pulled off there to the bottom side. They all have to work just to earn that little doormat pile of cash that's in front of them. Pretty humbling. Here we see the U.S. budget in 1 hour. $435,841,200. So the U.S. government's having to spend that much in an hour back in 2011, and of the amount shown, they have to borrow $187,785,388. So they're borrowing $187 million an hour back in 2011. Moving on, the U.S. budget in a day. Here we got, what is that, $10 billion. $10,460 million per day they're spending. And of that, they have to borrow $4,506 million every single day. They're borrowing that much every day. Just to put things into perspective, look at all of the world's silver reserves. This is 29,665 tons. These are the official holdings of all the world's silver reserves. You've seen this slide before. That calculates into 32,150.7 troy ounces times the 29,665 metric tons times the current price of silver of 17.413 is 16.607. So around 16, we'll just call it 17. $17 billion in silver. Again, the U.S. budget in a day back then was $10 billion. So they're spending in one day basically the entire world's silver reserves almost every single day. If it's gone up since then from the $10 billion it was in 2011, you're looking at, they're almost spending the entire world's silver reserves, official holdings, every single day. And if anything, they're borrowing at least half of that. Here we've got the U.S. budget in a week. Now brace yourselves here because it gets worse. All these numbers just keep getting bigger. U.S. budget in a week, what is that? What does it look like there? $73,221,000,000. Well, they're borrowing $31,547,000,000 every week. So in a week, they are borrowing literally twice the amount of all the silver reserves. Remember the silver reserves, all those silver reserves that we looked at, the 29,665 tons of silver equaled 16.60 billion US dollars. That just goes to show if they are borrowing 31 billion and all the silver reserves is 16 billion, every week that goes by, the US government is going into debt the amount of silver of all the entire amount of the world's silver reserves. In 1 month, the U.S. government spends $318 billion, and they're borrowing $137 billion every month. That's how much the U.S. government has to borrow to do what it is they do. Putting things into perspective, I took all this gold here, which is the entire U.S. gold reserves. Of course, you know the U.S. government values their gold at $42 an ounce, so it's in their mind only worth $11 billion, but we know that's not the case. So there's all the stated and supposed U.S. gold reserves, 8,133.5 tons. Well, if you multiply the troy ounce amount, how many troy ounces are in one of these tons, times the, for simple math's sake, $1,200 per ounce, you get $313.79 billion. So $313 billion. And what do we have here? The U.S. government spends in a month $318 billion. So they are spending in 1 month's time, the U.S. government spends all of the gold that they have, and they do that every month, every year, forever. And it usually only goes up. And again, they're borrowing half that approximately. So just imagine this giant pile of gold that you see, all the U.S. gold reserves. Every month, they have to borrow approximately half of what that pile, all of those bars, are worth. $313 billion worth of gold spent on a monthly basis. Here's the U.S. budget in 2011, $3,818 billion. $3,818 billion. And they had to borrow $1.65 trillion. Now we're going to look further at debt. Of all the money they borrowed, there's $100, there's $10,000, there's $1 million, not very big. Here's $100 million piled up in cash on a pallet. Here's $1 billion. There's a billion. Here we have a trillion. There you can see $1 trillion. In 2011, the U.S. federal deficit was $1.412 trillion, 41% more than you see here. So just the deficit alone in 2011 was 41% more money than you see right there. If you spend $1 million a day since Jesus was born, you would have not spent $1 trillion by now, but $700 billion, the same amount the big banks got during the bailout. Think of that. You'd have to spend $1 million a day for 2,000 years. $1 trillion. Now remember the images of the precious metals we looked at, which would be dwarfed by this. Now this is the U.S. debt in 2017. Right now, $20+ trillion. The Statue of Liberty seems rather worried as the United States national debt is soon to pass 20% of the entire world combined economy, GDP, gross domestic product. Here are some cool quotes from the founding fathers of the United States of America over 200 years ago, saying the right things about the future and, in a sense, predicting today. I place economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat and drink, in our necessities and in our comforts, in our labor and in our amusements. Thomas Jefferson. If ever again our nation stumbles upon unfunded paper, it shall surely be like death to our body politic. This country will crash. George Washington. I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. Thomas Jefferson. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Thomas Jefferson. A wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government. Thomas Jefferson. First inaugural address, March 4th, 1801. All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, not from a want of honor or virtue, so much as the downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. John Adams of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. If we can but prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them, they must become happy. Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Cooper, November 29, 1802. It is incumbent upon every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted on, would save 1/2 the wars of the world. Thomas Jefferson. So you're seeing the palletized piles of cash that represent $20+ trillion surrounding the Statue of Liberty. That's the U.S. debt at this time. All of that cash. The U.S. debt 2017, $20 trillion. If you look carefully, you can see the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty no longer keeps her arm and torch up high and proud. Debt is slavery, and she knows it. Each floor of each pillar is worth $10 billion. There's an American football field hiding inside Statue of Liberty's prison cell made of debt. 67.5% of debt is owned by U.S. citizens and American entities. This includes the Federal Reserve, which, explained in simple terms, buys U.S. debt, government bonds, and with newly printed Federal Reserve notes, money, the Fed writes blank checks to itself from an unlimited checking account, then buys the debt through various financial mechanisms. New money is introduced into the financial system through this mechanism. The debt will likely never be paid back, and here's why. Unless there is a completely new paradigm in thinking, history shows that public U.S. debt will very likely never be paid back. The politicians make grand promises during elections. Then, when they can't find the cash to keep their promises, they borrow money. Paying back means making difficult decisions and losing the seat in office. It is always easier to borrow from the nation's children's future. Instead of paying back these piles of money, the piles will be made worth less through inflation. Money will most likely be printed. That means the holders of U.S. debt will get back less than they were promised, arguably defaulting on the debt in terms of real purchasing power. $122.1 trillion. This is the United States unfunded liabilities. This is all the money that they have promised. The $122.1 trillion super skyscraper wall is the amount of money the U.S. government knows it does not have to fully fund Medicare, Medicaid, Medicare prescription drug programs, Social Security, military and civil servant pensions. It's the money the U.S. knows it will not have to pay all of its bills. If you live in the USA, this is also your personal credit card bill. You are responsible, along with everyone else, to pay this back. The citizens of the USA created the U.S. government to serve them. This is what the U.S. government has done while serving the people. The unfunded liability is calculated on current tax and funding inputs and future demographic shifts in U.S. population. There you see the old World Trade Center surrounded by stacks of cash, each representing $4 trillion again. That is the unfunded liabilities of the United States. We're going to take a different direction. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Fund, and the insurance of the financial institutions where everyone supposedly has their cash in banks. The FDIC insures 7,181 financial institutions. The FDIC is funded by financial institutions that pay for deposit insurance coverage. During the 1980s and 90s savings and loan crisis, a parallel insurer, the FSLIC, Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, went bankrupt. The FSLIC replacement named RTC was merged into the FDIC. The savings and loan crisis cost taxpayers $150 billion. So there's the $25 billion FDIC insurance fund. Here are some of the largest financial institutions in the United States: Citibank, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. Those are their buildings. The top 5 banks are unprofitable without tax subsidy. The top 5 banks, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, are not profitable without tax subsidy. The earned profits for the Big 5 are almost entirely a gift from taxpayers. Full detailed earnings lists are found here. They include links for it. $68.9 billion, 5 times the biggest bank profits with subsidy. Typical annual report. $63.5 billion, the value of taxpayer-gifted funded subsidy. On the left, you see $9.3 trillion. These are the deposits at commercial U.S. banks, $9.3 trillion. However, on the right, you see total U.S. currency and coin, all dollar bills and all coins in circulation. There's approximately $1.1 trillion in circulation. $25 billion in cash is the FDIC insurance fund. Here you see the United States derivative exposure. This is the 300 trillion, or 300,000 billions. Now look at all of that cash. Derivatives are wild financial bets made by banks in order to speculate or hedge risk, ranging from stocks, bonds, all the way to weather. In essence, a casino-style bet. The total notional derivative exposure of the top 25 holding companies is $297,517 billion. Notional means, quote, a small amount of money controlling a large position. Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Citibank, and others have a massive derivative exposure and have moved its derivatives into FDIC-insured accounts due to their downgraded credit ratings. Bank of America alone moved $75 trillion to FDIC-insured accounts. There's a lot of legal jargon in the way of protecting depositors before derivative counterparties. In the 2008 crash, it was derivatives based on the likelihood that debt would be paid that triggered the global economic crisis of 2008. The high rollers of Las Vegas don't know how to roll compared to bankers. The viability of FDIC to save a large-scale bank failure is in question. And there you see the $300 trillion total U.S. financial derivative exposure. Now compare that to all the gold in the world ever mined in a solid gold cube. If all the gold ever mined was melted into a solid gold cube, the cube would measure 20.5 meters on each side and would fit in an Olympic swimming pool just as you see there. Well, how much would that gold cube be worth approximately? Again, all the gold ever mined 166,500 tons. Well, it would be worth approximately $6.4 trillion. Only $6.4 trillion after all the numbers and all the cash that we've seen and discussed just now. If you take 32,150.7 troy ounces per ton and you measure that times 166,500 metric tons times the approximate value of gold at $1,200 per ounce, you get $6.423 trillion. $6.4 trillion. Again, the derivatives is $300 trillion. The U.S. debt is $20 trillion. Think of that for a moment. $20 trillion. The U.S. owes over 3 times all the gold ever mined in history since the beginning of time. Compare it to silver. All the silver ever mined in history. If you look at all the silver ever mined in history, you only get $790 billion. Not even a full trillion. Only $790 billion at the present value. Of the silver that exists, because as you know, much of it has been destroyed or lost in time, as you can see there, silver lost throughout history. Of the silver that is left, we're looking at only 435 billion US dollars. So if you add up all the gold ever mined in history at 6 trillion, 6.4 trillion, and then you throw in the 435 billion, all the gold and all the silver in the entire world only equals roughly $7 trillion. All of it. All the metal, all of that precious metal ever mined since the beginning of time, and all that's left, 7 trillion. And you see there what we just went through, all the debt, the derivatives. It might be boring. It might not be the most interesting topic of conversation. But I think each one of us realizes that if there's ever a reset, if this game ever comes to a standstill or an end, once the number's up, I believe there's a race. There's a race, a quiet, behind the scenes, covert operation of governments to position themselves and to take up positions in order to defend themselves and their interests from what might be coming of the numbers we just talked about and just saw. Because we know it's impossible to service this debt, to address these things. And the one thing we do know is when metals finally react to the amount of cash, the amount of debt, and the global money supply, what's out there, it will be staggering. It will be a shock. It will be a mind-blowing event. That we can be certain. This is why I started stacking. It's numbers like this that motivate me. So ignore the crap you see on the fake news, the garbage you see on CNBC and MarketWatch and any of the financial news networks. Ignore guys like Dave Ramsey that are trying to get you suckered into purchasing stocks and bonds and investing in these failing casino-like enterprises. Ignore the people that are trying to get you to gamble with your hard-earned labor and put it into these structures. They can't print gold. They can't print silver. And they surely can't fake their way out of this. Thanks for tuning in to the Junius Maltby channel, the most boring channel on YouTube. Thanks for being here these last 4 years. Please like, share, and subscribe.